So, dear colleagues, let's start. Welcome to yet another event, seminar of the Open Society Hub for the Politics of the Anthropocene. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jeff Colgan, who will be talking today about the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015 and whether the political agreements and political unity around these agreements actually resulted in in practical side, especially from the companies. Professor Colgan is the Richard Holbrooke Professor, the Department of Political Science and Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs at Brown University. And Professor Colgan's research focuses on international order and security, especially as related to energy and the environment. So, Professor, the floor is all yours. We have overall 90 minutes. If you 45, 60 minutes presentation, and then we'll have questions from the audience and maybe from the online audience.
Great.
Thank you. The
Great.
floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll aim for something more like 35 even, so that we have plenty of time to discuss. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and also to all of you for coming this evening. I know there are always other choices, especially in a city that has so much going on like this one does. So it's good of you to come. And I want to just pay sort of thanks and tribute to the organizers and particularly the hub, the Anthropocene Hub, because so many universities are only just at the stage of really starting to grapple with what climate change means for politics and how essential politics is for moving forward and addressing the climate crisis, and not just from a sort of technical perspective, but really understanding the social science of it as well. And so it's really great to see projects like this taking on. So I have been working on this topic for some time now. My original research was all about the politics of oil and particularly its international security consequences. But I've moved increasingly into the politics of climate change because, of course, this is the great global question of our time. And so this question, the question I want to address with you today is one of the things that if you are an international relations scholar, as I am, you have to be worried about, which is that when we talk about international organizations and summits that lead to, if not treaties, at least international agreements with some real effect, we need to worry about whether they're having the downstream effects that they ultimately are intended to have. And this is, so it's easy, or relatively easy, to get states to come into a room and sign a piece of paper. But the question is, does that actually change the behavior of the companies who are not the only emitters on Earth, but they are the sort of majority source of pollution that's affecting the climate. So I have to know whether we're getting. So that's the big and unfortunately very difficult question to answer that I want to address today. And so the core question is really, to what extent did firms shift resources, meaning their corporate resources, towards decarbonization in the wake of the 2015 Paris Agreement, the sort of landmark agreement? And one of the reasons that we're asking this question now is that we are at roughly a decade later. And so it's time to take stock. And it's actually a tricky question because some of the effects might take quite a long time to actually appear. And so we're not necessarily going to give, we're not going to be able to give a totally full and complete definitive answer to this question. But 10 years on, it's time to sort of take stock of how we've done. And if not now, then sort of when. And so, okay, so let's focus on this question. As I've said, firms, not just the governments, the states, are the key polluters. And existing research within political science offers two very different and conflicting answers to this question. There's a sort of strong yes and a strong no potential. So I want to sort of dig in and find out where the truth lies. This is challenging for a couple of different reasons, but one of them is that many of us come to this question with some strong prior beliefs just based on, our own view about the world and the news that we absorb, et cetera. And so it takes, I think, special effort to sort of stop and say, okay, we're really going to focus in on the data and be rigorous about how to answer the question and how to park our own prior beliefs to the side, particularly when some of you, certainly I, have things that I want to be true, right? I kind of want the answer to be yes to this question, but just because you sort of motivated for one part of the answer doesn't mean that that's how you should ultimately decide. Okay, so what are the potential answers to the question? On the one hand, within international relations, you see a number of scholars coming out saying, look, we should expect strong, significant impact of an agreement like the Paris Agreement, in part because it was supposedly a sort of an all-hands-on-deck kind of moment, where the agreement was supposed to catalyze behavioral change, not only by the governments that were the signatories to the agreement, but also to subnational actors, state and local governments, corporations, and NGOs, all manner of actors to come towards some sort of catalytic cooperative moment. And it may have even tried to signal a kind of policy shift, or even what Catherine Sickin calls a norm cascade in favor of climate action. On the other hand, those of you studying international relations will no doubt recognize this a concept of cheap talk, right? That this idea that international treaties are not always followed by their signatories, and in particular, states tend to sign agreements that they know they were sort of going to match their own behavior anyway, right? So they sign weak agreements that wouldn't necessarily move their behavior on time, right? And so the lack of enforcement that is not a bug but a feature of the Paris Agreement, right? Having learned from the sort of failure of the Kyoto Protocol, then there's this potential for greenwashing or cheap talk, et cetera, from the members. Okay. So how do we find out? Our approach to this question is to kind of go deep on a particular set of questions to really look at the behavior, because it's not like there's an easy data set of thousands and thousands of corporations that one can look at and say, aha, this is how they change their behavior in response to the Paris Agreement. We don't have that available. So instead, we want to focus in on a particular set of firms that we can kind of get our hands around. And in particular, we want to look at companies that are in the middle of a spectrum that ranges from companies that are sort of very green, like, say, renewables manufacturers, or companies that are already selling solar and wind or what have you, which were probably not going to change their behavior a whole lot based on the Paris Agreement, because they're already doing the things that Paris would want, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, let's say big oil, right? Big oil companies are unlikely to change their behavior because they're big oil, right? That they're selling a product that depends on opposing decarbonization, and while their behavior may or may not shift, if we didn't see behavioral change there, that would hardly be a fair test of whether the Paris Agreement was actually having. So we want to focus on the ones that are in the middle. And by middle, I mean companies that have an opportunity, a business opportunity to do something different that is sort of technologically available, that is relatively cost competitive, that could change their business model and contribute to a sort of decarbonized world without having to go out of business altogether, right? And so one of the sectors that is maybe the most likely case for that is the vehicle manufacturing sector, right? Where they could switch from the internal combustion engine, the ICE type car, to electric vehicles, right? And here I'm including plug-in hybrids, anything that actually runs on electrons rather than petroleum as its base fuel. And So we focus on the incumbent car manufacturers, right? So we're not focusing on Tesla necessarily here. We're looking for the 12 firms that contribute to roughly 80% of global car manufacturing. The impact that we're looking for is really measured by the extent to which they switch to electric vehicles away from the kind of conventional cars. And the reason we're focusing on that is that tailpipe emissions account for more than 75 of their total emissions of these firms, right? So the fact that they may or may not be polluting, or have polluting efficiencies in their own factories while they're manufacturing the firms is less interesting than what kind of product they're actually building, because that's where the pollution actually mostly is, right? So we're less interested in, say, their scope 1 emissions, the ones that are associated with the actual manufacturing process itself, just because that's not where sort of the big juicy target is. Okay, so what are the ways that we might see are affecting this behavior, right? So we're trying to be really systematic with this and to a certain extent agnostic upfront about what we might see. So we think of sort of the 3 most likely mechanisms that we might see. One is if the agreement itself provided some direct material incentives in some way for the firms to change their behavior, right? That would be the sort of most obvious way. And we have seen treaties, international treaties in the past that look a little bit like this, right? So the Montreal Protocol is one of the kind of classic examples. A second possibility is, look, maybe the treaty itself didn't do that at all, but it motivated national governments to change their policies, which in turn affects the government, affects the firms. And so we get this kind of slightly indirect effect. And then a third potential mechanism is that Paris might have affected the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, to apply pressure to the firms, either directly or through their investors or through their consumers or what have you, right? You can imagine a bunch of different ways that might happen. But all 3 of those, at least theoretically, could have changed the behavior upfront. We acknowledge that this is not a fully exhaustive list, and one can imagine even more indirect routes, right? So you can imagine, say, the Paris Agreement affecting the kind of zeitgeist out there that is that ultimately changes behavior in ways that are really difficult to measure and to observe. And we acknowledge that that's a possibility, but precisely because it is so difficult to observe, we're just going to say, look, we can't trace that, we can't evaluate that from a social science perspective. So we're going to focus on these 3. Okay. So then what we do in the paper, and I'm happy to share the paper if anyone's interested, is to sort of lay out, well, what kind of how do we evaluate these 3 mechanisms? And I realize this table's got a lot going on, but I'm going to walk through it a little bit carefully. So first of all, just down these 3 rows are the 3 mechanisms. That's 1, 2, 3 that I just described in the last slide. And then the first thing that needs to be true on this second column here are things that we need to observe in the world for the mechanism to work at all, right? So for instance, if we think that the agreement generated some sort of material incentives, then we should be able to look in the text of the agreement itself and say, aha, this is where we see some change in terms of generating those incentives. And so we can go evaluate that, right? So that's what we did. We went and looked at the agreement to see whether that was happening. We looked at the national policy of the major economies of the world, not every country in the world, but we looked at China, the EU, the United States, Japan, and South Korea, right? These are sort of the 5 largest, the most important economies, especially for the automobile manufacturing industry. And I'm a Canadian, so I say this a little bit sadly because it's a pretty big car manufacturer, but it generally follows the United States. So we focused on those. And then third, we looked at what new non-state actors that were linked to the Paris Agreement, such as SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiatives, did they get generated? What did they do, et cetera, right? So we looked at those things. Those are sort of what we call necessary preconditions. Because if those weren't true, then the rest of this is kind of irrelevant, right? If that didn't happen, then the mechanism didn't work, right? That's our first. The next three rows or columns here are all related to firm level evidence, right? So now we've looked at sort of the structural situation and what changed in the world. That was step one in this column. The next step is to go look for level, firm by firm, right? All through all 12 firms and look at 5 different types of evidence. And it's only 3 columns, but this first one actually has 3 different types of evidence looked at. First of all, we looked at what companies said they were going to do. We looked at how the corporate executives talked to investors on quarterly analyst calls. We looked at their CDP reports, which used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. For now, reasons unknown, they've gone just to their acronym, CDP. And then we also looked at their targets and their, in particular, their announcements around EV product lines. So those are 3 things that can change relatively quickly, which is one of the reasons we wanted to look at it, right? Because you can observe that in a very finite period of time right after the Paris Agreement. And if Paris is having an impact, we'd expect that to happen fairly quickly. The next thing that we can look at, which takes a little bit longer to happen, is investments, right? So how much, if firms are really motivated by the Paris Agreement to change their behavior, they're going to need to put money into their factories to retool their factories so that they can change their product lines to start producing EVs in a bigger way, right? So that's the second thing we can observe. We can get that data, we can see how much money they spent. And then the last thing, of course, is sort of on some level the most important thing and the most intuitive thing you'd want to look at is how many EVs did they build, right? Like what was, in particular, of all the cars they built, what was the product share that was decarbonized, right? Electric vehicles or product plug-in hybrids. And of course, that's really important, but it's also something that tends to take longer, right? Because it's not like you can just even a well-motivated corporation that wants to switch into electric vehicles needs some time to develop those firms, develop those products. And exactly how long is a little bit unclear, but we have seen that in certain cases, when a company really wants to do this, they are able to develop new vehicles, new electric vehicles in very short timelines, much shorter than sort of the average product development that you sometimes see. Okay, so let's go and look at the actual data, the evidence, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I interpret them to sort of come back to the overall answer to this question. So I'm going to start with the sort of rhetorical moves. And so what we did here was to look at the transcripts from analyst calls. So these are quarterly analyst calls where a corporate executive, usually the CEO, but sometimes the CFO, another officer, talks to analysts about what's going on. And one of the things that we wanted to know was how much did they talk about climate change in these calls, and did that change after the Paris Agreement? And so what you see down here is when did the calls happen? This is the year that they happened. It runs from roughly 2000 to 2022, which I think was the last time that we could get data on this. And you see the big vertical line here is this is when the Paris Agreement occurred. And what you see is that for this purple line, which turns out to correspond to the company BMW, there is an uptick in how much they talk about climate change. So that's good. The less good news is that for the other 11 firms, there really isn't much of an uptick. There's kind of a slow upward drift, which is good and consistent with increasing sort of concern about climate change, but it doesn't seem to be in any way motivated by the Paris Agreement itself, or at least it's not well correlated with 2015, which is when it was signed. You could argue 2016, which is when it was ratified, but nonetheless, the answer doesn't change much. So that's a bit of a concern in terms of the overall first postulates. So we've got some good news for BMW, but maybe not so much for the others. Okay, well, let's not just take analyst calls. There are other ways of looking at this. So another thing to look at is targets around EV investments and EV product production. And so, one thing I should do, I'm going to talk about the second and third mechanism here, but I should go back and just, before we dive into this, talk about the first mechanism. The answer is basically no, this mechanism didn't work because it failed on this first step. That the Paris Agreement itself did not generate material incentives to motivate direct change by firms. It was intended to on some level. There was something called Article 6 that was supposed to generate a market for carbon credits that was globally if not binding, at least functional. And that Article 6 has been a subject of negotiation at every single COP since, including the one that's happening this week right now. And there's sort of, I think, a declining optimism about whether that will ever happen. And so right now, I think we have to code that as, unfortunately, a failure. Right. So this mechanism is not one that we're going to go deep on because we don't see that the agreement doing that. Okay, but the other two, we see a more plausible case. For national policy change, it's a pretty weak story in that you can see the EU moving, at least changing behavior after the Paris Agreement and rhetorically linking or justifying why they're doing it in reference to the Paris Agreement. So I think there's at least some plausibility that the EU is responding that way. You don't see that in the United States. You don't see that in Japan. You don't see it in South Korea. You might see it in China. China is a much harder one to read because it's authoritarian, and we, the authors, have kind of humility about our ability to read what's exactly going on in China. So we just sort of hunt on that one. We don't make a strong position about whether that's happening or not. But there's at least a case that maybe Europe did this, and so we're willing to sort of investigate whether it affected the firms in other ways. And then in non-state actors, there's kind of clear evidence. Yes, some new non-state actors did get generated, and so we want to investigate how they. Okay, sorry. I'm now going to come back to my more firm level evidence and look at the targets. And so if these national governments, if it's the second mechanism that's really driving the behavior, then we should expect some sort of nationally specific targets that the firms are setting, right? So that when they're selling into the European market, they're responding in that way, and they're maybe doing different things in other markets as well. And we do have some evidence of that for 3 firms out of the 12, right? BMW, Daimler, and Ford do reference the European changes in European regulations and behavioral change for that. For 5 other firms, the evidence is really quite weak and much harder to make the case, or it's complicated because of, say, VW, for instance, which had a Dieselgate scandal right around the same time. And so it's very hard to attribute what they're doing to the Paris Agreement because Dieselgate is sort of complicating their whole. And then you have 4 other firms, especially the Japanese ones, that don't set any target changes that are different after Paris at all. So you really don't see evidence. Okay. So again, 3 out of 12. All right, not great, but there's some other. On H3, you have the evidence suggests that the firms are mostly ignoring the non-state actors, including SBTI, which is probably the one that has the sort of most visible public presence. And so that's really unfortunate. Again, a couple of exceptions where BMW and GM sort of do appear to seriously engage with the non-state with SBTI, but less so with the other actors. And the other 10 firms that we just don't see a lot of evidence. Okay. What about, I'm going to skip the targets one and just move right into the mud. So what about investments? And here it's a little murkier to get because the investment data that we have available isn't EV specific. This is sort of investment generally. But if we expect that firms are sort of retooling their factories on a significant scale, then this should show up in their overall investment. And what we see in the investment dollars is unfortunately not a lot of change consistent with the Paris story. Probably the best case scenario one is like if Paris is really driving change, we might see something like what GM does, which is where you see this big uptick around the time of the Paris Agreement. So that's the one we think of as kind of the most likely case if Paris was happening. There's another possibility, which is something like Nissan, which did have this product, the Nissan Leaf, which is an electric vehicle. They've been putting a lot of effort into it. They had sort of a steady, relatively high level of investment, which might be consistent with sort of transforming towards an EV story, although it's a little less clear that it's really Paris that's doing the work because it's so consistent. But nonetheless, maybe it's plausible. For the other companies, it's much harder to tell a story that we see a lot of not just rhetorical change, but actual financial and manufacturing change in products, including even in our star company so far, BMW. So that's a little bit worried. Okay. Finally, what about the car products themselves, right? So here again, is the vertical blue dash line is the year of the Paris Agreement, and we expect that there'll be some sort of lag time. It might be a little bit hard to evaluate when the EV sales actually change. But what we're looking for in particular is these two quite dark bars, because they're the ones that are indicating EVs and plug-in hybrid vehicles. And what we'd like to see is within this kind of 5-year time period afterwards, a significant shift. And if you look hard and squint at the graphs in various ways, you might see, okay, so BMW did see some uptick. Okay, that's positive. GM maybe came a little bit late, but there might be something there as well. Hyundai, you get some significant shift as well. So that one is interesting. It's interesting that we see quite a lot of shift in their product line, but we didn't see Hyundai as one of the stars in sort of the earlier thing, right? So there's a little bit of a mechanism question here. Like, yes, we're seeing some change in your uptick in EV, but maybe it's happening for other reasons, not rather than the Paris Agreement. For most of the other firms, you really don't see much of a sort of dramatic trajectory change as a result of, before and after 2015. Overall, in the whole sector, right, in all 12 of these firms, you see some upward drift in EVs. That's great. But unfortunately, that can be caused by a lot of things. It's hard to put that down to the Paris Agreement. Okay. So how do we interpret this? And this is, this is where the political scientist in me says, okay, now we have to think about causal inference, right? This is a tricky causal inference problem. And what we wish we had is, a second planet where we could say, okay, for planet A, we have the Paris Agreement. On planet B, we don't have the Paris Agreement. Now let's see what the treatment effect is, right? But as the great line in climate politics goes, there is no planet B. We don't have that second one. And so this is a very hard counterfactual to evaluate. But the question we think is just too important for us not to ask it. Right? We have to ask it as social scientists. And so then we start thinking, okay, well, what should we be looking for if Paris did have an impact? On the one hand, should we be looking for an immediate direct impact? Well, that would be great if we observed that. That would be a sort of definitive answer to the question. But just because we don't observe it, which we don't, doesn't necessarily tell us whether Paris might be having a kind of a more indirect. Another way of thinking about this is to kind of go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, Paris could be having an impact through a whole lot of different mechanisms. It might be very diffuse. It might be changing people's ideas. That might be taking a long time to show up in the real world. True, but if you stretch that idea far enough, it becomes essentially kind of non-falsifiable, right? It becomes meaningless when we start talking about impact in a way that it's like, yeah, it's out there in the zeitgeist and it takes 100 years to show up or whatever. Then it sort of loses the meaning of the word. So we take this kind of middle path where we say, look, let's assume that a corporation wants to change after the Paris Agreement and it has some reason to do so. There's one of these mechanisms that's actually operating. How long should we expect? Do we see change within a time frame that is consistent with a large corporation that wants to change its behavior. That's that middle path. So that's why we're thinking about sort of 5 to 7 years is kind of the window of time after the agreement. Okay. And so the method we took here was to say, okay, for each firm, we're going to have these 5 different sources of data. We're going to do process tracing on how they changed. We're going to consider confounding events like VW's Dieselgate. And we're going to do a little bit of synthetic interpretation of these 5 different sources of evidence, right? Because we're going to try to say these 5, they operate on different timescales, but they should add up. They should be consistent in some way. So where we have, behavioral change, but we have corporate executives that don't talk about climate change, or they explicitly say, which Peugeot's CEO did, no, the Paris Agreement did not change our behavior whatsoever. Then, we try to take that into account. And none of the data sources is totally determinative, right? Because they all have their own flaws, especially the sort of speech evidence, right? Because we know that actors can talk in ways that don't reflect their actual behavior. But together, we think that they paint a pretty good picture of whether this is happening. And our overall conclusion, unfortunately, is a little bit gloomy, but I do want to end with a more positive spin, right? So our overall conclusion is that, look, the Paris Agreement did cause some rhetorical change. People did talk a little bit differently, and the Paris Agreement was kind of like a nice focal point for CEOs and investors and NGOs and everyone to be able to talk about. But for only 2 out of the 12 firms do we have enough evidence for us to think, well, it's at least plausible that the Paris Agreement did change their behavior. And those 2 are BMW and Renault-Nissan. And then we can't rule out 2 others. So there's Hyundai and GM have some evidence in that direction, even though there are other indicators that don't add up all that well. So there's sort of mixed evidence on those. But for the others, right, so this is the other 8 out of 12, the evidence is pretty clear that Paris did not actually have that, or at least what we're seeing is a total lack of definitive evidence that it did, and that the Paris Agreement did have that. And so the implication, I think, is, especially for scholars, we have a lot of research out there that talks about the kind of negotiating dynamics. Every November, we have this political theater where we have a COP meeting. We have a lot of press around what's going to happen at COP. And this should give us, unfortunately, a sense of frustration and a sense of where the real action is going to happen, if it's going to happen at all, on climate change, which is typically at the national and subnational. Right? That's where the rubber hits the road, and where international behavior can be helpful is setting goals, technical standards, ways of talking and comparing behavioral change across each other, a lot of monitoring, a lot of technocratic efforts. So this is valuable at the UN level to make sure that when you promise to reduce by X% and I promise to reduce by X%, then X means the same thing across countries. That's where the UN process can be really valuable, by sort of setting the standards for what that means. But for actually driving the change of X% reduction, that's something that we can and should expect that to happen at the national level. All of that being said, would we go so far, we being the authors, would we go so far as saying, look, the COP meetings are a complete waste of time, we should shut it down? Well, we might be tempted to move in that direction, but we don't think it's a complete waste of time, because what does happen at these meetings, and this is not based on our evidence, this is not in the scope of this project at all, but what we see in other parts of political science research is that there is some evidence that these meetings are effective in getting non-state actors, social movements, climate activists together at these meetings, nominally to pay attention to what the official diplomatic negotiations are going on, but also in those 2 weeks to compare notes, to share with each other the tactics they're using, what's effective, what's not, what kind of information can they use from different countries. And that seems to actually affect the behaviors of the social movements themselves in ways that can potentially generate more pressure on the national governments to actually do something, right? And so that seems to be one of the largest impacts that we see. And so we're seeing that in research by my colleague at Brown University, Jen Haddon, and others who provide research that support that idea. I'll end on this note as well. In other work, right? So what we've done in this project is evaluate, did Paris have an impact on one particular economic sector? Can we broaden that and generalize from that? Well, I think this tells us something about what's going on in the economy, but in general, you should not try to interpret the whole world based on one academic paper, right? And so what's needed is a more consistent and thorough evaluation of how climate politics is affecting the economy. And so one other way that I'm looking at this with two other authors, Larson and Chalmensky, is how is the increased salience of climate politics over time? How has that affected the global financial system? How are things affecting like industrial policy, right? Heterogeneous national industrial policies. We see this especially with, say, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, but also here, Europe has been doing it for a long time. China has been doing it the most out of any major economy and for the longest. How does that affect the way finance flows around the world? How do international treaties like the Energy Charter Treaty affect it? How does carbon accounting, disclosure, and offsets, how do they affect it? And climate conscious investing like ESG investing or other types of investing, how does that, has that changed over time? And there we actually do see a significant impact of climate salience as affecting the global financial system. The harder question is whether the global financial system is actually driving some sort of environmental impact, right? And it's actually reducing our emissions. That's the question we really want to know. But at least the first step is, yes, we are seeing something of a change in the global financial. I could go on about that. I'm going to stop here and just maybe take a sip of water and invite some questions from you. Thank you so much for listening.
Professor Colgan, well, I'm sure that the audience has questions. I do also have questions. Great. One is just, I will just ask you to clarify, because you said in the very beginning, talking about the Paris Agreement and enforcement, and you compare that to Kyoto, saying that the Kyoto basically failed in terms of enforcing change. But then it also, and this is what I'd like to clarify, but it also seems that the Paris Agreement does not have enough enforcement here. Yeah. So this is one thing. The second thing, talking about various factors that could have an impact on change of behavior, and you said yourself that there are so many factors, and we cannot explain everything by the Paris Agreement. Well, one of those factors, at least in the EU, is the Green Deal of 2020 that could also provide an incentive. I saw that your data basically ends with 2022. I'm not so sure that you could see the change, these 2 years after the Green Deal. But still, what other incentives could there be, such as the Green Deal of the EU, but maybe something else? And the third question. And I know that you mentioned it briefly, Tesla, which is producing electric vehicles. And what I also find very strange, but not strange, but maybe curious in a way, is that Elon Musk, who's in charge of Tesla, is also buddies with people who deny climate change. So can you elaborate on this? Maybe provide some insights how it works in one and the same way. Autocrats, and Elon Musk seems to be quite sympathetic towards particular autocratic leaders. Autocrats tend to be, denying climate change, and still Tesla is producing electric vehicles. So,
yeah, thank you so much. Those are all really great questions. Of all the things that I would claim expertise on, the psychology of Elon Musk would definitely not be one of them. But I think we can say something about what we can observe with Tesla. And so let me start with that one. I'll go backwards to the question. Musk has obviously made sort of a huge bet on Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. election, and whether or not you agree with it, you can see what the sort of business case for why the world's richest man would want to be very closely politically aligned with arguably the most powerful actor in the world. Xi Jinping might have a thing or two to say about whether that's true or not, but anyway. And so you can definitely see not just Musk, but other, what you'd almost have to call oligarchs in the U.S. system now, Bezos and other tech billionaires, lining up to make nice with Donald Trump. Does this make sense from how do we rationalize the fact that Trump calls climate change a hoax with the fact that Tesla is producing kind of the low carbon alternative to the standard conventional vehicle? Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you put it that way, but it does make a lot of sense if you think about it from a cost competitive perspective, right? So the idea that if Trump undoes some of the subsidies for electric vehicles, it will hurt Tesla's competition a lot more than it will hurt Tesla itself. And so then it just becomes kind of a relative gains kind of prospect, and Musk comes out a winner out of that. And so then it makes a lot of sense from a strictly narrowly business commercial sense, even if from a broader story around EVs, it makes no sense at all. And that actually is really an important point that we should say is not unique to Musk, and not unique to the EV sector. It's also, you see this sometimes in the oil and gas sector, where some oil and gas firms want environmental regulation because they are well aware that, at least in certain ways, their environmental performance is stronger than their competition. And their competition is often smaller firms that are kind of playing even faster and looser with environmental practices than they are. And so they want those smaller firms kind of driven out of business, and therefore they want the whole sector to face a higher standard. And so you get these kind of complicated dynamics. One question is whether, and now I'm really rambling, so apologize for that, but one question is that you see ExxonMobil's CEO, there was a headline just a few days ago about how he had publicly told Trump, please keep the US in Paris Agreement, don't pull us out of the Paris Agreement like you did last time, or at least tried to. And on the face of it, big oil, why do they want to stay in Paris Agreement? Well, one way that might make sense is this idea that ExxonMobil and Chevron would benefit on a relative scale versus sort of all of the what are called the independents, all of the sort of smaller oil firms in North America and around the world that are doing more methane flaring, doing all kinds of other things that if the sector is more regulated, Exxon and Chevron actually benefit from in a competitive way. The other way to read that statement, to be fair, is that it's completely cynical, that it's greenwashing. He's saying, oh yes, publicly we should stay in the Paris Agreement, and privately saying, hell no, let's get out. And we have no real way of knowing which one it is. So that being that. Let me just say one more word about Tesla, actually. Because I did want to talk about this, and this is why we didn't include an analysis on Tesla. We did focus on the 12 firms that are sort of incumbents. And one of the reasons for doing that is that the company trajectory, we think, was already sort of fairly well established pre-2015, right? Before the Paris Agreement occurred. It was founded in 2003. It mass produced its first car in 2008. There were 100,000 Model S sales before the Paris Agreement was signed. So this is a company that was sort of already doing what it was doing. And so we don't think that the Paris Agreement necessarily changed its behavior a whole lot. I mean, certainly expanded the sort of enthusiasm for the market. But one thing that I think is another way of, I'll just say that the consumer demand for its product was large, in fact, in excess of what it could actually produce, which one would think would generate a real business opportunity for the other 12 firms to move into this sector, right? So there's sufficient consumer demand, and that's why we focus so heavily on the actual firm behavior rather than the consumer behavior, because we just got to take the consumer demand as an assumption. You had two other questions, so let me just at least briefly answer them. On the enforcement side, yes, Kyoto had theoretically some enforcement mechanisms, right? That there was an idea that countries would sign up to particular targets, and if they failed to meet them, then they would face, a kind of penalty in the subsequent 5-year period. The subsequent 5-year period never really came to be because the whole process just fell apart after the U.S. and then subsequently others pulled out of the treaty. And so that's why we consider that sort of a failure. And therefore, Paris is, as my legal friends keep reminding me, it is technically a legal agreement, a legally binding agreement. I tend to view it as not a very binding agreement because it's legally binding, but what's binding are these things called NDCs, right? Nationally determined contributions. And so this is a legal agreement where each party to the agreement agrees to set a target, but they get to set the target, which to me sounds like a not very binding agreement at all. And so it's sort of legally binding, but only in the sense that you get to set your own target. Would we like this agreement to have kind of more teeth, more enforcement power? Of course we could. We would, but this is the essential problem of international relations, right? Where we have no world government, no sort of actor that can enforce these contracts. And so, in a very real sense, the Paris Agreement was designed to address that problem, to recognize, look, there isn't going to be a kind of binding target to sort of force countries to do something that they don't want to do. Instead, what we're going to do is say, look, every country, you figure out what you can do, and we're going to try to hold each other accountable in a sort of like support group, Alcohol Anonymous kind of way, right? Rather than with a big stick, because the big stick doesn't exist. Right? It just doesn't happen. You had another question.
Yeah, and there was the Green Deal and some other factors that could potentially influence the decision of firms.
So I have some hope that domestic policies like the Green Deal do actually drive behavior of firms. In fact, I think you can make a much more compelling case that what these firms do depends a lot on electoral politics at the national level. In fact, recently, just in the last 12 months, we saw a number of car CEOs saying this quite explicitly, like, it's going to be a big year for our policies because we're going to see a whole lot of national governments, change hands. And so they're waiting to see what the sort of national signals are. So they really pay attention to national policy, national regulation. Absolutely. But the question that we wanted to answer was, how much does Paris Agreement drive this sort of thing? And there, I think that the case gets a lot harder to argue, well, maybe the Paris Agreement caused the European Green Deal to happen or the Inflation Reduction Act to happen, et cetera. But maybe not. And it's actually very difficult to know. So in a world, say, where the countries met in Paris and failed to come to an agreement, so there was no Paris Agreement, would you still get those domestic actions? Well, quite possibly, because that failure at the international level might have driven the domestic politics to say, wow, we gotta step up our game. And maybe the Inflation Act reduction action happens anyway. And so it's just much harder to make a really strong causal claim that that's what's happening. And at that point, we become like full-on speculators, and I'm uncomfortable doing that as a social scientist. Thank you for those great questions. Others? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. So nice. I'm just wondering. I will start from the aspect of the Article 6 of Kyoto Protocol, either is a failure or not. I sat at one side event of COP28 in Dubai last year, and this issue was raised. And the conclusion was that we may not say we have a quick and direct impact of it that we can say, oh, this is what we are expecting now, but indirectly, we can also see the impact. And that's why I want to bring that idea to also your presentation today, that though 2 out of 12 from your result are those that are, we say that actually being influenced or impacted by Paris Agreement. But are we looking at it in terms of the direct impact of the Paris Agreement or the indirect ones? Because the remaining 210, I'm still, as a scientist, looking at it that could be, and I like the way you conclude too in your conclusion, there could be a kind of indirect influence of Paris Agreement and what they are doing currently. For example, those that are producing EV vehicle, EV, for example, are triggered maybe by Paris Agreement. And others have to follow because in order to keep themselves in international market, because of the competition, the whole trend is tending towards EV. And when we look at it, that may not be direct impact of Paris Agreement, but one way or the other, I don't know that you think that way, it's still indirect impact from the Paris Agreement. So globally, I don't know your view on that, because it may not be directly that agreement is actually influencing anything directly, but indirectly, one way or the other, is influencing the behavior of all these big firms in order for them to be able to also be competitive enough to cope now and also to cope in the future with the trend of the production, especially of EV. Like, I don't know, just thinking that, yeah.
Do you want me to answer, or should we collect you as you wish? Thank you.
Yeah, let's.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you for the question. You're absolutely right that we can't give a definitive answer of whether there's any kind of impact, however indirect, for it. Just as, arguably you could say, well, listen, Kyoto, might have fallen apart in terms of the specific mechanisms that the way it was designed to operate, but it still might have had an impact in terms of shifting people's mindsets, et cetera. Possible, yes. The trick is that if we want to understand why electric vehicles have the market share they do today, from a social science perspective, we have to sort of be open to a number of different alternative explanations. One of which is just that the technology has gotten better over time, that batteries have gotten cheaper, that we're seeing kind of economies of scale, that we're seeing demonstration effects, and these seem like plausible, right? And so that in itself may be driving some of the trend that we're seeing. And can we definitively rule out the Paris Agreement? No. I think you're making a good point in that regard. But our goal with this paper was to say, look, if you thought of a number between 0 and 100, where 100 was you were 100% confident for sure the Paris Agreement definitely created impact, and 0 was nope, it definitely didn't, then whatever your number was in that spectrum before reading this paper, I think the number would have to probably go down when you look at the evidence that we're offering here. Which is not to say that we're going to drive you to all the way to 0 or all the way, the other way. But probably it shifts you to a certain degree. That's certainly the way I look at it, is that we just can't, given the tools that we have, get to a definitive answer one way or another. But it's nonetheless useful to think about that. And I say useful, not just from like a, academic, it's nice to know in a seminar kind of way, but on a concrete level, if you're a climate activist, if you're an NGO and you're thinking about, well, I only have so many people and so much time in the world and so many resources, do I want to send my people to the next COP meeting, or do I want to send them to my national capital and try to influence behavior a different way? This, I think, affects the way you think about the world, right? And you have to say, okay, well, it's not that this is useless, because I can learn some good things maybe from other NGOs around the world, but maybe I can do that sort of once every 3 years instead of showing up every single COP meeting, and sort of reallocate some of my time to do something more.
Colin.
Thank you so much for your talk. We've been looking forward to this, to your visit in the center for a long time. So really fulfilled our expectations and exceeded them. Basically, I was curious about like the rhetorical shift after Paris. In particular, like if you saw, obviously you mentioned that like BMW and Renault actually kind of like put their money where their mouth was per se. But I was curious to see if you noticed anything significant in terms of like, I guess just in particular, like those firms, if there's anyone who really like picked up the greenwashing, but didn't really reflect that in their new policies or like their CapEx or anything.
You mean for BMW or Nissan Renault?
I don't know,
or for some of the...
more so like just the other firms that like really just didn't do anything, and it was quite obvious, or if it was obvious to you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the one that's a little bit puzzling, is GM, where you see like a significant shift in their investment, but it seems frankly to be much more tied to what's going on in US domestic politics. And so, in 2015, Obama's president, and even 2016, Obama's president, and they're saying, right, we got the memo coming out of 2008 financial crisis, like we almost went bankrupt. You want smaller cars, you want more efficient cars, and you want EVs. Got it. Yes, sir. We're on board with this. And then Trump gets elected, and they're like, EVs. What are you talking about? And they just sort of walk away from that perspective. And in fact, they join. Trump has a lawsuit against California. California is trying to move ahead with EVs, even of course it's Democratic, so it's more left-leaning, and they're trying to push forward on this, even as Trump is busy pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And GM joins the lawsuit against California. Well, then 2020, Biden gets elected, and GM says, "Oh, we're out of that lawsuit. We want nothing to do with it," right? And so, to me, cynically, I think that like that's the kind of like I wouldn't say I was surprised, but it may be even more cynical to the extent to which, corporate leaders were willing to kind of follow the political headwinds in with that respect. And so, that the relevant political headwinds are not at the international level. They're at national. No, that sort of shifts how I thought of it. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
We also have an online question, too, actually. I will just read them.
Great.
I would like to ask a question regarding the research and investment slide, but it also applies more general to the analysis. Most of the companies that you have mentioned, addressing to you, that you have mentioned over the last decade or longer have either merged, like Nissan Renault, Stellantis, etc., or have intense joint venture in particular when it comes to the development of ZEV, especially EVs, such as Volkswagen and Ford. In how far has this been accounted for in the research? I will then read the second question of you.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. Of course, it sort of complicates our life to a certain degree, and have we paid attention to it in the research? Very much so. When I give the presentation, I try to simplify it a little bit and say, okay, we're going to talk about 12 firms. If you look at some of the graphs, actually, you'll see like 13 graphs sometimes because of exactly this, where we're like pulling apart, say, Nissan and Renault. We get different graphs for some of those precisely because of this sort of merger effect. And then also, Fiat Chrysler merges with Stellantis, and so there is some of this. But even when you sort of try to pull apart the different companies that look, like they might be, now they're put together, but maybe we're individually doing something different. The sort of answer doesn't seem to change that much. And so for simplifying the actual story, we treat them as 12 firms. You have the second one.
Yes. Yeah. A second question I would have is on the graph that you have shown on how far is there a difference in companies that right before the Paris Agreement have already had their EVs on the market, like Daimler and BMW, compared to companies like Honda, Mazda, Ford, etc.
Right. So the thing that we're looking for ultimately is less a change in the level of electric vehicles or ZEV kinds of vehicles. It's what we're really paying attention to is a change in trajectory, right? A shift in how much attention the individual companies are. And so this is one reason why we're a little bit nervous about saying that we put Nissan in the sort of the positive category, right? One of the two firms where you could make a fairly plausible case. But even there, frankly, we're nervous about saying, yes, Paris did have an impact because the Nissan Leaf was selling well before the Paris Agreement, and to what extent it actually, the Paris Agreement changed the counterfactual on what would have happened without the Paris Agreement ever being reached is really unclear. And so we want to see that uptick in firms. And this is, I think, the clearest in the case of the three Japanese firms, where the Japanese government really didn't seem to respond to Paris with any kind of change in national policies. And the Japanese firms, which, all the firms globally, are going to respond to regulations if they're selling in that market. And so most of these companies are selling into the Japanese market, but the Japanese companies have a bigger presence in the Japanese market. And they seem to respond the least to the idea that they should do something different. In fact, famously, they kind of continue to go on hybrid vehicles and make very little investment in electric vehicles altogether. And so we just don't see a lot of shift in their view.
Yeah, thank you. And also the author of those questions, he asks for this full paper. Maybe it could be uploaded on the page of the event, on the announcement page. So
I'd be glad to share it. I should say that it is still under peer review at the moment, and so
like a draft.
I'm happy to share the current version of it, but it's probably not going to be. Well, it'll probably get tweaked a little bit before ultimately being published. But here's hoping that it will eventually be published. But I expect it will be.
Thank you. Do we have further questions? I have another question, which is quite different from what you discussed.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the positive effects, and it was very nice to finish with the conclusions, which are cautiously optimistic. Not every lecture on climate change is so positive a bit. So you mentioned that those COP meetings, at least one, probably there are some other positive impact, is that those NGOs and those groups which try to influence firms and companies, they exchange opinions, they share notes, they see what lessons learned. If you looked at those, what activity of those NGOs do you find most effective when we're talking about how those NGOs are trying to influence the decision making of those firms? What are the best practices in your opinion?
Well, I'm a little bit out past my realm of expertise, but I'll share what I think we know from the social science, which is that these NGOs are often wrestling with a couple of really important questions. One of which is how radical to be, right? So you can imagine tactics that are more, backroom behavior or discussion based or persuasion with policymakers or with firms, sitting down with the corporate executives in some quiet room and hashing out what to do, versus like throwing soup on paintings and shutting down highways and potentially even taking more violent approaches. I don't want people blowing things up and what have you. And so there's some, I think, cross-national comparison between, groups that are taking those more, and this is, I mean, this question is prevalent for all social movements, right? Of like the sort of the radicals versus the reformers, right? And that question of, which tactics to use, there isn't a right answer, a universal solution. Different situations call for different responses. And so very often, I think these climate groups are talking to, the Belgians, they're talking to the British and to the, Germans and maybe even the Americans, although that's a different context, like what to do and what's worked well and what gathered attention. And of course, there's a question here about what metrics the social movements themselves are using for success, right? I mean, maybe it's policy change, but maybe it's also like clicks on their website or donations that they're getting and what have you, which don't necessarily translate into, success in terms of reducing emissions at the end of the day. Right? So I think there's some of that. The other question, I said there were two, the other question that they're constantly wrestling with is how should NGOs or actors that are focused on the climate interact with actors that are not focused on the climate? Do you want a narrow coalition or a broad coalition? And that's actually also kind of a classic question, very difficult question to answer, because sometimes you want really big tent movements so that you can get the most people, to support the change that you want. But by broadening the tent, you sometimes take on new actors that dilute the focus and the impact that you might have, right? And so this is, I think, especially relevant in the era when Black Lives Matter was kind of at its peak around 2000, 2001, where there was lots of wrestling in many countries of like, how much should the climate movement be allied with the kind of racial justice movement or the environmental justice movement, so and taking that on is tricky. It's complicated, and so there's some sharing of information on that. Having said all that, like, which are the best practices? I don't know, right? And I'm not sure anyone does know, but because, as I said, there's sort of there's no recipe, right? There's no like one solution for
No silver bullet.
Yeah, and so it depends on the context, and I think the most likely what most likely is going to happen is you get good learning when you talk about countries that are either quite similar political context. And so I can then turn to you and say, aha, you're doing something, I'm in Denmark and you're in Sweden. I can talk to you and figure out, that's a fairly similar political context. They're not identical. And anybody who's Danish or Swedish will be like, wait, we're totally different. But they're closer than many other countries in the world, right? Or even from quite different political contexts, right? When the activists from the UAE talk to the activists in, Belgium, those are very different contexts, but just new ideas that one country is doing something very different than what another country is doing. Sometimes that sort of cross-fertilizes ideas where you're like, oh, we didn't think about doing that, but that's like, I think I could take that and adapt it and do it here. I've exhausted our room. Thank you so much for engaging. This is, of course, such a difficult problem, right? And you probably had this in your classes about like the 12 different reasons why climate politics is hard, right? It's intergenerational, it's international, it's like, it's all the things. It's a distributive politics thing where you have a powerful economic interests that are vested against change. I mean, it's just on and on and on. And so cracking this nut is not something that is easy to do. But when you think about universities and their purpose in society, I mean, I don't just mean at this moment, but in like historically, if you look from the Reformation onwards or even farther back, what students have done, what academics have done, and try to generate novel ways of looking at the world, new ideas to approach our topic differently. And that's something that this group, this hub is working on, and I think, you know, across the world, that's what universities are struggling to work on, because without some new ideas about how we can do things differently, we won't make progress when the political opportunity space opens up, right? And right now, that space may not be very large, but it won't stay that way forever. And so we have to be ready for when those moments come. And so that's the purpose, I think, of working on climate politics ideas now in preparation for those moments.
Thank you. Another positive note, and then let's congratulate. So we can discuss other questions. I think there's a little bit of a reception, if I understand correctly. So everybody is invited.
I'm over there, you know, the
Yeah.
corridor.
Thank you.
What do you mean?